She was 3 years old. Tiny hands, bright eyes, a laugh that once filled the air. Then she was gone. Her name was Kayleigh Slusher. In February 2014, officers stepped into a small apartment in Napa, California. What they found would haunt them forever. A child lying still on her bed. Her skin was cold, too cold. They looked closer, bruises everywhere. Deep, dark marks covered her fragile body. A closer look revealed something even worse. She hadn't just been hurt, she had suffered. The people who were supposed to love her, her mother, Sarah Kruger, and her mother's boyfriend, Ryan Scott Warner, stood accused of something unimaginable. This case is not just a story. It's a warning, a call to pay attention, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. As we go deeper into this story, you'll see just how many people could have made a difference but didn't. You'll hear about the shocking discoveries, the disturbing secrets, and the lies that unfolded. And just when you think you know how bad this story is, there's more things that will leave you questioning everything. As we go through Kayleigh's final days, her suffering, and the fight for justice, stay with us. This will not be easy to hear, but it must be told. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. If this is your first time here, I truly appreciate you stopping by. If you love true crime stories that dig deep into real-life cases, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. And for those returning, I'm grateful for your support. Now let's talk about one of the most heartbreaking cases you'll ever hear. Stay with me until the end. Let's start at the beginning. Because every story, no matter how tragic, begins somewhere. Sarah Kruger was not the kind of mother who held her child close at night, whispering lullabies until she drifted off to sleep. She had a past. Born in California, Sarah grew up in a household that, on the surface, looked normal. A small-town girl, quiet in school, unnoticed. But behind closed doors, life was messy. There were fights. There was instability. There were days when she didn't know what version of her mother she would get. The gentle one, or the one who seemed far away, lost in her own world. By the time she reached her 20s, Sarah had learned one thing: attachment was dangerous. She kept people at arm's length, moving from one relationship to another. Then, at 24, she became a mother. Kayleigh was born on a cold January morning, her first cries filling the hospital room. For a moment, it seemed like everything would change, that Sarah would be different, that love, pure and overwhelming, had finally found her. But love alone was not enough. The first few months, neighbors remember seeing Sarah take Kayleigh on walks, a quiet woman, always looking over her shoulder. No father in sight. Sometimes, she'd leave Kayleigh with family members for days at a time, coming back with a hollow look in her eyes. Then she met Ryan Scott Warner. That's when everything changed. Ryan Warner did not enter Sarah's life by accident. A drifter. A man whose past was marked by bruises, both given and received. He had seen jail cells, known the sting of handcuffs, petty theft, violence. It all clung to him like a second skin. By the time he met Sarah, he was 29. He had no job, no home of his own. What he did have was a way of talking that made people listen. He knew how to take control. They met in mid-2013. By the end of the summer, he had moved into her small apartment in Napa. A one-bedroom space, barely big enough for 2 people. But now there were 3. Neighbors would later say that something shifted when Ryan arrived. Kayleigh, once a playful little girl, became quieter. The bruises started showing up, sometimes on her arms, sometimes on her legs. Sarah had explanations. She's clumsy. She fell. Kids get hurt all the time. But no one saw her fall. No one saw her laugh anymore either. Ryan had taken up all the space. He had a way of making sure the air was his to breathe, the time was his to spend. And when meth entered the picture, everything else, food, sleep, the well-being of a child, became unimportant. Kayleigh Slusher was slipping away, and no one stopped it. There was a time when Kayleigh was safe, before the bruises, before the long nights without food, before the world turned into something cold and cruel. She was just a little girl. She loved princesses. She had a stuffed animal, a small bear, she carried everywhere. She liked to twirl, spinning in circles until she got dizzy. Her laughter was loud and free, the kind that made people turn and smile. She called her mother Mama. She trusted her. And then, little by little, that light faded. The last few months of her life were not filled with bedtime stories or warm hugs. They were filled with hunger, pain, and nights where no one came when she cried. Neighbors noticed. A little girl who used to run up to strangers with a grin now looked at the ground when spoken to. The sparkle in her eyes was gone, and the bruises, there were always new ones. One neighbor, an older woman who lived across the hall, remembers the last time she saw Kayleigh. She had walked past Sarah's apartment and caught a glimpse inside. Kayleigh sat on the couch, her hands in her lap, her face turned away. Ryan was there too, pacing. His voice was low, angry. The woman hesitated, then knocked on the door. Sarah answered, forcing a smile. "She's okay," Sarah had said. "Just tired." The woman looked at Kayleigh again. The child didn't move. That was 2 weeks before Kayleigh died. No one knew it then, but time was running out, and the worst was yet to come. A child's world is small, a bedroom, a playground, a mother's arms. Kayleigh's world had been shrinking for months. By the fall of 2013, something was different in that small Napa apartment. The door stayed closed more often. The laughter had disappeared, and Kayleigh, the little girl with bright eyes and endless energy, had begun to fade. The bruises started showing up more often, small at first, a mark on her arm, a shadow beneath her chin. Sarah always had an excuse. She fell off the bed. She bumped into the table. She's just clumsy, and people wanted to believe her. But then the bruises got darker, larger. A neighbor, an older man who lived 2 doors down, had once seen Kayleigh outside with Sarah. The child had lifted her arms for her mother to pick her up, but Sarah had only looked away. Kayleigh stood there for a moment, arms still raised before slowly dropping them. That was the last time he saw her smile. Inside the apartment, things were getting worse. Ryan had taken control. He didn't work. He didn't leave. His days were spent getting high, pacing, muttering under his breath. He was paranoid, angry, and Kayleigh was caught in the middle. Sarah's mother, Kayleigh's grandmother, had called the police. She had been worried. She had seen the bruises. She had heard the way Sarah talked about Kayleigh, the way she seemed detached, like the little girl was a problem to deal with rather than a child to love. She made the call. She reported her concerns. Officers arrived. They knocked on the door. Sarah answered, smiling. Kayleigh peeked from behind her mother's legs. The officers asked a few questions. Sarah said everything was fine. Kayleigh didn't say a word. There was no proof, no clear evidence, nothing they could use to take the child away. So they left, and the door closed again. Kayleigh had always been a friendly child. She would wave at people, giggle at strangers, run up to pet dogs on the sidewalk. But in December, she changed. She stopped talking. She flinched when people moved too fast. She seemed smaller. One woman who lived in the apartment across from Sarah had knocked on the door one evening. She hadn't seen Kayleigh in days and wanted to check in. Ryan answered. His pupils were wide. He grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She's asleep," he said. The woman hesitated. Something felt wrong. The air in the apartment smelled stale, unwashed. She could hear the TV on, the sound of a video game, but no child. She wanted to ask more, but Ryan just nodded and shut the door. By January, Kayleigh was barely seen at all. She was kept inside, hidden. The bruises had become impossible to explain. Sarah rarely left the apartment. When she did, she walked fast, head down, like she didn't want to be noticed. Ryan barely let her out of his sight. Inside, the drug use had escalated. Methamphetamine kept them awake for days, their tempers short, their grip on reality slipping. The food ran out. The apartment smelled of sweat, of old clothes, of something rotting in the air. Kayleigh was starving. She cried for food. But instead of a meal, she was silent, a sharp word, a cold stare. And when crying didn't work, she stopped trying. Then, one night, January 29th, something happened inside that apartment. Something no one would hear. Something that would end with Kayleigh's small, fragile body crumpled on the floor. The details of that night would later be pieced together in court. The final, desperate moments of a child who had suffered for months. The next morning, Kayleigh did not wake up. Sarah and Ryan didn't call for help. Instead, they made a decision. One that would make this case even more horrifying. They placed her body in the freezer. For hours, her small frame lay among frozen bags of food, ice forming along her skin. And then, when it was over, when the shock had worn off, they took her out, dressed her, and laid her back in bed. As if she were sleeping. For 2 days they lived in that apartment with her body. For 2 days they acted like nothing had happened, until someone came knocking. The truth was about to come crashing down, and it would be far worse than anyone could have imagined. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, heavy. For 2 days, Kayleigh's body remained there, frozen in time. Sarah Kruger and Ryan Warner continued living as if nothing had changed. They ate, they smoked, they slept, they never called for help. But they knew the clock was ticking. Something had to be done. January 31st, 2014. That morning the phone rang inside the apartment. Sarah picked up. It was an old friend. Someone who had known her before Ryan. Someone who hadn't heard from her in weeks. The friend asked about Kayleigh. Sarah hesitated. Then she laughed. A dry, forced sound. "She's fine," she said. "Just sleeping." The friend's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. That feeling wouldn't go away. An hour later, the friend made a decision. He picked up the phone and called the police. The words were simple but urgent. "You need to check on that little girl." The knock came at 10:30 a.m. sharp, loud, final. Inside the apartment, Ryan and Sarah froze. They knew what was on the other side of that door. Sarah looked at Ryan. His face was pale, his fingers twitching. They had no plan. No lie that could cover this up. They had one choice. Run. Ryan grabbed his jacket. Sarah stuffed a few things into her bag. They opened the back door, slipping out before the officers could push their way inside. Down the stairs. Into the alley. A few blocks away, they reached the bus stop. Sarah kept her head down. Ryan kept checking over his shoulder. They thought they had time. They were wrong. Meanwhile, the officers had forced their way in. The stench hit them first. Stale air, old food, something else. Something worse. The apartment was a mess. Clothes on the floor, trash piled in corners. And then, the bedroom. The officers stepped inside. There she was. Kayleigh Slusher, lying in her bed. Her small body tucked under a blanket, her hands placed at her sides. At first, she looked peaceful, as if she were only sleeping. But then, they touched her skin. Cold. Ice cold. This was no recent death. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Then they noticed her lips. A faint bluish tint. Her skin unnaturally stiff. And one officer, shaking, unable to look away, said what they were all thinking. "She's frozen." The pieces started falling into place. Kayleigh had been dead for days, and at some point, before laying her in bed, someone had placed her in a freezer. Her tiny body trapped in the cold for hours. Maybe longer. Why? What kind of mind could do something like that? The officers stood there, staring at the impossible. Kayleigh Slusher's body was found. The apartment on Wilkins Avenue was no longer just a home. It was a crime scene. The air inside was thick, not just with the smell of death, but with the weight of a truth too terrible to ignore. A child had suffered here. A child had died here. And the ones responsible? They were already running. Less than an hour after police entered the apartment, Sarah Kruger and Ryan Warner were gone. They had slipped out the back, weaving through side streets, avoiding main roads. Ryan pulled Sarah by the arm, his grip tight. "We need to go," he muttered. Sarah's hands trembled. She kept looking over her shoulder. They had no car, no plan, just a single goal: disappear. A city bus rattled down the street. Ryan grabbed Sarah's wrist and pulled her toward it. They stepped on, faces down, ignoring the driver's glance. Sarah clutched her bag to her chest. Inside, a few clothes, some cash, her phone, and Kayleigh's favorite stuffed animal, a reminder of what they had left behind. The news spread fast. Within hours, a description of Sarah Kruger and Ryan Warner hit every local station. Wanted for questioning, a missing child, suspicious circumstances. The first call came in at 2:47 p.m. A woman had seen them at a gas station in Vallejo, just 20 minutes from Napa. Sarah had walked inside, eyes darting around. Ryan had stayed outside, pacing. Something about them felt off. They looked nervous, the woman later told police, like they were waiting for something to happen. She didn't know exactly what was wrong, but she knew enough. She picked up her phone. She dialed 911. By the time the police arrived, Sarah and Ryan were gone. Napa PD issued an official alert. Neighboring counties were on high alert. Surveillance cameras were checked. Traffic cameras scanned. Detectives retraced their steps. Where would they go? Who would help them? But Sarah and Ryan weren't reaching out to anyone. They weren't calling family. They weren't calling friends. They were isolated. And isolation meant desperation. By night, they were in Berkeley, hiding in plain sight. They had made their way to a homeless encampment under the freeway. Ryan blended in easily. Dirty clothes, a vacant stare. Sarah kept her head down. They didn't talk. They barely moved. They thought no one would recognize them here. But someone did. A man, another drifter, had seen the news. He watched them from the other side of the camp. At first he wasn't sure, but then he heard Ryan say something under his breath. "We never should have stayed in that apartment." The man made a choice. He walked 2 blocks to the nearest gas station. He called the police. "They're here," he whispered. "Send someone, now." Sarah and Ryan made a mistake. They were tired, hungry. Sarah had convinced Ryan to stop somewhere, just for coffee. They walked into an IHOP restaurant in El Cerrito. The morning crowd was thick. Families eating pancakes, servers refilling coffee cups. They thought they could blend in. But a woman near the window looked up. Her stomach dropped. She had just seen their faces on the news that morning. She didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone under the table. She sent a text, and then she dialed 911. "They're sitting in the back booth," she whispered. "They don't look like they're leaving anytime soon." Police responded immediately. Within minutes, unmarked cars surrounded the restaurant. Officers stepped inside. Ryan looked up, saw them, and froze. Sarah's breath hitched. Then they ran. Big mistake. They shoved past tables, knocking over plates, spilling drinks. A waitress screamed. The door swung open, but police were already there. Guns drawn. Shouts filled the air. "Get on the ground, now!" Handcuffs snapped around their wrists. The escape was over. And now the real questions would begin. But nothing could prepare investigators for what they would uncover next. The truth behind Kayleigh's final hours. The pain she endured, the real reason her body had been frozen. The next part of this story is even worse. There are stories that stay with you. Stories that haunt the walls of an interrogation room long after the case is closed. This was one of them. When Kayleigh's body was examined, the truth came pouring out through every bruise, every scar, every mark left behind by months of suffering. The evidence was undeniable. What the autopsy revealed would silence the courtroom. No one, not even the most hardened detectives, could prepare for what they were about to hear. The medical examiner began carefully, slowly, as if afraid to touch something so fragile. Kayleigh's body told a story of pain, a story of time, a story that no child should ever have to tell. 41 injuries, not just fresh bruises, but old ones, layered beneath new ones. Some had already begun to heal, proof that the abuse had been happening for weeks, months. Her arms, her legs, her torso. The bruises stretched across her tiny frame like a map of suffering. The medical examiner paused, took a breath, and then they found it. Deep inside Kayleigh's small body, her intestine had ruptured. A tear so severe that it caused internal bleeding. This wasn't a quick death. It wasn't painless. The injury alone wouldn't have killed her immediately. She had suffered for hours, maybe even a full day. Pain that no one should feel, let alone a child. A searing, burning agony that only grew worse with time. And through it all, she was ignored. No doctor, no hospital, no mercy. Just the walls of that apartment, closing in, and the people who were supposed to protect her, doing nothing. In the interrogation room, Sarah and Ryan sat across from detectives. They were asked a simple question. What happened to Kayleigh? Sarah fidgeted. Ryan stared at the floor. Then came the lies. They said she must have drank something poisonous. They said she fell down. They said they had no idea why she was covered in bruises. The detectives didn't flinch. They had heard it all before. Then one officer leaned in, voice steady, unshaken. She had a ruptured intestine, he said. Do you know what that means? Sarah didn't respond. It means she was in pain, the officer continued. Pain so severe she wouldn't have been able to move. She would have been screaming, crying. Still, silence. The officer's voice darkened. And you're telling me you didn't hear that? Sarah swallowed hard. Ryan looked away. The silence was louder than any confession. They were running out of lies. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became. Kayleigh had been trapped in that apartment with two people who had lost all sense of reality. Ryan's past was filled with drug use, paranoia, and violent outbursts. Sarah had changed the moment she let him into her life. Their world revolved around methamphetamine, staying high, staying awake, staying in control. And in the middle of it all was Kayleigh, too small to fight back, too young to understand what was happening, too innocent to know that the people she loved would be the ones to hurt her the most. The abuse wasn't a one-time event. It was routine, it was methodical, it was torture. Then there was the freezer. Investigators needed to know, why had they placed her there? Sarah had no answer. Ryan mumbled something incoherent, his fingers tapping against the table. Then the forensic team stepped in. They examined the body, the frozen tissue, the unnatural stiffness. And the answer became clear. Kayleigh hadn't just been stored in the freezer. She had been put there to cover something up, to slow decomposition, to buy them time. Sarah and Ryan hadn't wanted to get caught, so they treated her like an object, like a thing that could be hidden away. They had left her in the cold, like she was nothing, and when they thought it was safe, they took her out, dressed her, placed her in bed, and pretended she was sleeping. But Kayleigh was never going to wake up, and now there was no more hiding. The evidence was undeniable, the truth was out, and justice was coming. By the time Sarah and Ryan were taken into custody, the charges were already being prepared. The evidence? Overwhelming. The crime? First-degree murder? Special circumstance? Torture. If convicted, there would be no second chances. No way out. Sarah sat in the interrogation room, her hands shaking. Ryan slumped in his chair, staring at the floor. They had nothing left to say. And even if they did, no one was listening. Their freedom was gone. But the fight wasn't over, because now, the trial was coming. And what would happen in that courtroom would shock everyone. The evidence was in, the arrests had been made. But justice wasn't immediate. It never is. Sarah Kruger and Ryan Warner had been caught, but now the case has moved to the courtroom, where every detail would be exposed, where Kayleigh Slusher's final moments would be dissected, and where two people would finally face the weight of what they had done. The trial was about to begin, and no one was ready for what they were about to hear. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered. Reporters filled the benches, the public leaned in, waiting. Kayleigh's family sat in the front row. Her grandmother clutched a tissue, her hands trembling. And then, the doors opened. Two deputies walked Sarah Kruger and Ryan Warner into the courtroom. Sarah looked down, her once blonde hair now dull and lifeless. Ryan walked with slow, deliberate steps, eyes fixed ahead, as if he wasn't there. They had been in jail for 5 years by the time the trial began. 5 years of waiting, 5 years of delays, 5 years of building evidence. Now there was nowhere left to hide. The prosecutor stood, her voice calm but firm. She wasn't going to let anyone forget what happened to Kayleigh Slusher. She started with the evidence: 41 injuries, a ruptured intestine, severe blunt force trauma, malnutrition, and then the freezer. A place meant for food, a place where no child should ever be. Sarah winced when they showed the crime scene photos. Ryan looked away. The jury? They stared, some in horror, some in disbelief. One juror wiped their eyes. Kayleigh had suffered. And the people who should have protected her? They had done nothing but harm. Sarah's attorney stood, clearing his throat. He knew the facts weren't on his side, so he tried something else. Sarah loved her daughter, he said. She never meant for this to happen. The jury didn't move. The evidence said otherwise. The defense argued that Sarah was a victim too, trapped in an abusive relationship controlled by Ryan Warner. They pointed to his history, his violence, his methamphetamine addiction. He was the real danger, they claimed. She was just too afraid to stop him. Ryan's lawyer? He had a different strategy. He blamed Sarah. She had custody. She was the mother. He argued she had the responsibility. He painted Ryan as a man under the influence, someone too drug-addled to know what was happening. He wasn't in control of himself, his lawyer claimed. But the jury wasn't convinced. Because the evidence? It told a different story. After weeks of testimony, after every gruesome detail had been laid bare, it was time for the verdict. Sarah and Ryan stood, hands folded in front of them. The judge looked down at the paper. And then, in a voice that echoed through the courtroom, he read, "Guilty. First-degree murder. Special circumstance. Torture." Sarah let out a quiet gasp. Ryan didn't move. Kayleigh's family, they held each other and wept. They had waited 5 long years for this moment. And now, it was over. 2 months later, Sarah and Ryan were brought back to court for the last time. The judge's words were sharp. "You both had every opportunity to stop this," he said. "You didn't." He looked directly at them. "You let an innocent child suffer. You let her die. And then the final blow. You will both serve life in prison without the possibility of parole." The courtroom was silent. Sarah closed her eyes. Ryan's jaw clenched. There would be no appeals, no second chances, just a lifetime in a prison cell, alone with the truth of what they had done. Kayleigh Slusher was only 3 years old. She never got to grow up, never got to go to school, never got to have a future. But because of her case, laws were strengthened. Because of her story, people paid attention. And because of justice, the people responsible will never walk free again. But still, one question remains. Could this have been prevented? And if so, how many other children are waiting for someone to save them? Kayleigh Slusher should have been safe. She had people who loved her, a grandmother who was worried, neighbors who noticed. But somehow, the system failed her. And she wasn't the first. And she won't be the last. What went wrong? And how many warnings were ignored before it was too late? Before Kayleigh's death, people noticed things. Neighbors saw bruises. They saw her weight drop. They saw her energy fade. She was once a bright, happy child. But in those final months, she had changed. She lost her sparkle, one neighbor said. Kayleigh's grandmother noticed too. She called the police. She told them something wasn't right. And the police? They checked. But then they left. Because legally there wasn't enough to take Kayleigh away. And just days later, she was gone. Child Protective Services (CPS) had been involved before. Sarah Kruger had been investigated. But every case has rules. And sometimes, those rules don't protect the child in time. A bruise here and there? Not enough. A child seeming withdrawn? Not enough. A worried grandparent? Still not enough. The law is clear. To remove a child, there must be immediate and clear danger. CPS can recommend parenting classes. They can do home visits. They can monitor. But without undeniable proof of abuse, their hands are tied. Sarah and Ryan were both using meth. And methamphetamine doesn't just harm the person using it. It destroys everything around them. Users become paranoid, angry, unpredictable. They stop eating, they stop sleeping, they stop caring. Meth turns parents into strangers, and children? They become collateral damage. Kayleigh never stood a chance. Could someone have stopped this? The hardest question to ask. What if the police had taken Kayleigh away that day? The neighbors had called one more time? The system had been faster, stronger, better? Would she still be here? Or was her fate sealed the moment she was born into that home? Her story shook Napa, California, and it did more than just shock people. It changed the law. In 2020, Kayleigh's law was passed. It gave police more power to remove children in cases of suspected abuse. It strengthened protections for vulnerable kids. It made sure that what happened to Kayleigh wouldn't happen again. But laws can only do so much, because child abuse still happens, and the only way to stop it is to see it, to report it, to act. If you see a child in danger, don't wait. Call the police, call child services, tell someone, because one phone call could save a life. Kayleigh's story didn't have to end this way, and maybe, just maybe, the next child's story won't have to end at all. Kayleigh Slusher was only 3 years old. She didn't know what betrayal was. She didn't understand addiction. She didn't know that the people she trusted the most would be the ones to hurt her. She only knew how to love. And for that, she suffered. Her life was short. Her death was painful. And the question that haunts us all is, why? Her case sent shockwaves through Napa, California. People couldn't believe it. How could no one stop this? How could a mother allow this to happen? How could a child suffer for so long and no one intervenes in time? Even now, years later, her story still lingers. Laws were changed, awareness was raised. But is it enough? Because the truth is, Kayleigh wasn't the only one. And even today, there are still children living in fear. Right now, at this very moment, there is another child just like Kayleigh. Now, I ask you, if you saw something, would you speak up? Would you call for help? Would you risk getting involved to save a life? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think could have been done differently? What should change to prevent cases like this? And most importantly, how can we as a society do better? Because this isn't just Kayleigh's story. It's a reminder that children depend on us. And when the system fails them, we can't. Kayleigh Slusher deserved more. She deserved love. She deserved protection. She deserved a future. And though we can't change what happened to her, we can change what happens next. Her story isn't just a tragedy, it's a warning. And it's up to us to listen. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notification so you never miss an upload. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case in the comments below. What could have been done differently? Until next time, stay safe, look out for one another, and I'll see you in the next video.